Attack! I am Dungeon Thrasher Lenny Blade, and this is the Dungeons and Thrashers show. And this will be a special episode. The last few episodes I've been talking a little bit about my history in role-playing games, and after recording I've always done a little bit of research, and finding pictures and whatnot to up the massive production values here at the Dungeons and Thrashers show. So, and I found myself really enjoying that, so I decided to, hey, why not just make a whole episode, two in fact, of my history with tabletop role-playing games, when I started playing, which games I played, and so on. In order for you to have a little bit of context, I will have to get into a general history about Swedish role-playing games as well. So if that's not your thing, if you don't give a shit about the very important, very massive Swedish 80s role-playing game scene, then you can skip a couple of minutes in the beginning. But yeah, so this first episode on my history will be from about 85 up until maybe 91 or so, maybe 92, 93, let's see where it takes us. So yeah, I thought that would be interesting, yeah, let's do this.
There was one company in particular in the 1980s in Sweden that helped spread the role-playing game hobby, and helped it become the mammoth that it became, because the Swedish scene was absolutely huge. I think people from outside of Sweden have a problem appreciating just how huge the scene was here. Just to illustrate this, the best-selling RPG franchise of the 1980s was Dungeons and Dragons. No one was surprised. But the second best-selling series was actually Drakkarukkumona, which was a Swedish language game, with a target audience only in Scandinavia. So that should tell you something about how huge it was. So this company called Äventyrsspel, or I think the main company was called Target Games, and they released board games and role-playing games under, through other companies, and Äventyrsspel was the role-playing game company, or something like that. So the first version of Drakkarukkumona was released in 1982, but it didn't really take off until 1984 when the second edition was released. And I think that's the edition where most of us remember, because that completely opened the floodgates once that black box edition was released. And two more games were released that year. And the first one was Mutant, which completely took off, especially in later years, and it became a franchise and went a little bit nuts. I'll get into that a little bit later. And there was also a horror game release called Shock, and that completed the unholy trinity of Swedish tabletop role-playing games. And when it came to releasing new versions, Drakkarukkumona pretty much followed the old Dungeons and Dragons / TSR business model, releasing an expert, or Drakkarukkumona expert, box set. You don't need to be a linguist to guess what expert means. And after that they released something called Drakkarukkumona Gigant, which roughly translates into like Titan, I guess. And that had more like mass battles and rules for castles and fortifications and like mass combat and things like that. And then they also released sort of an Oriental adventures called Drakkarukkumona Samurai. So if you're one of those guys who thought Oriental Adventures was offensive, our version for Drakkarukkumona was actually called Drakkarukkumona Samurai. So that was sort of the Far East version. And then we also had Drakkarukkumona Ivanhoe, which was more of a low fantasy medieval setting, and there were tons and tons of other stuff produced for Drakkarukkumona, and it's been re-released since then, like new versions of Drakkarukkumona, since tabletop role-playing game became a thing again, like, I don't know, 10 years back or whatever. So, but I remember playing a lot of these games. I even played with my older brother and with the other kids at school, because remember, role-playing games were huge in Sweden, so you could walk into any classroom at this time and someone would be playing a role-playing game during recess. It was quite amazing, to be honest. And yes, I remember I was mostly a player when it came to Drakkarukkumona, but I did run a few things. I ran one model called Torshem, and the box set called Marsklandet. I remember I did a little bit of that and a little bit of my own sort of things. But at this point, where we were still just kids, like 85, 86, we just created our own stuff. Like, we would take maps from one module and then just put it anywhere, and we would take NPCs and monster stat blocks and, you know, mix between them, and you know, we would just create our own stuff rather than just run adventures as they were released. I played Drakkarukkumona from probably from around 85 to 90, and because after that, sort of English fantasy role-playing games took over, and I started playing MERP and Rollmaster and RuneQuest and a lot of English language games, a little bit of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and things like that. So, but the next big game, or not the next one, I played all the three from the Unholy Trinity at the same time. But Mutant was the other game that I really played a lot. I was the dungeon master more often than a player when it comes to Mutant, and that was the post-apocalyptic game, sort of Äventyrsspels answer to maybe Gamma World or Metamorphosis Alpha, perhaps. And yeah, it was released in 84, and there was quite a few modules and adventures released for it. It also had a sequel called Mutant 2. Yes, very original, but Mutant 2 was even better, and just like Expat before it, it made the transition to a D20 system from a percentile. The first Mutant was also a percentile system, but Expat changed Drakkarukkumona to a D20 system, and Mutant 2 did the same with the Mutant franchise. And that kept on going, and that was absolutely amazing. That series, probably one of my favorite games. But after that, like in '89, there was a new version of Mutant, and it's known now as Mutant 2089, and that was more of a cyberpunk. Had more of a cyberpunk feel to it, probably very inspired by games like Shadowrun and Cyberpunk. And that had a lot of modules as well, and that one that's probably the longest campaign I've ever ran, and that was for Mutant 2089, and I ran that with my friends, and I really came into my own as a game master there, and I still love that version of the game. And that evolved into something called Mutant Rymd, and that became, you know, you had the big shoulder pads and you know, the big weapons. It wasn't post-apocalyptic anymore, it wasn't even cyberpunk anymore, it was Warhammer 40k style, and that morphed into Mutant Chronicles just a few a few years later, or 1 year later or something, and that's sort of when I lost when I lost touch with Mutant, because I became more and more interested in like thrash and death metal and started playing in bands and things like that, and I started playing role-playing games less and less. So, and also I didn't find it that interesting anymore. But, you know, I'm all for, you know, trying out Mutant Chronicles in the future. That would be cool. But at the time, I was like, no, you know, I'm done. And that franchise took off as well into comic books, video games, computer games, and board games, and even miniature games. So that had its own, and there's a new version of it as well, just like Mutant has a new version called Mutant Year Zero, or Mutant År Noll. So yes, Mutant, awesome game franchise. I don't have that much to say about Shock, the horror game that Äventyrsspel released. I do remember that I played that a lot in school. But yeah, I never owned, or I did own it towards the end, but I got a second-hand copy, which I sold maybe a year later, so I was never a huge fan of Shock, even though I did enjoy it when I did play it, so... but that has sort of died out. It never became anything, really. But it was popular at the time. Now, it should also be said that Äventyrsspel didn't only release role-playing games. They also had solo adventures and novels, and they also released a couple of board game and war games even, and they even licensed out their names to miniature companies, and they released a couple of miniatures and lots of other cool stuff as well. And after that, there weren't that many of the newer Swedish role-playing games that I got into. I played Cult, or Kult, as we say, once or twice. I thought it was cool, but again, at this time, I was all about, you know, shredding. I was all about playing metal at this time, so, you know, I played it, but I never bought it. And I should probably also mention that Cult was sort of got some bad press because there was a murder and one suicide that people thought were connected to Cult, the role-playing game. So I guess I should mention that as well. So, anyways, this is not by any means any comprehensive history of Swedish role-playing games, but this is just, you know, my experiences. And there were also two games that were licensed, Star Wars and MERP. Star Wars became Stjärnornas krig, and MERP became Sagan om ringen. But I will go through those in the next episode, because they are sort of English language role-playing games, because they were translated, so my English audience can relate to those a lot more. So yeah, I guess that's it for this time. See you later.